Hello and welcome to another edition of Only in Illinois, your weekly video recap from Reboot Illinois. I'm Madeline Dubeck here with Matt Dietrich, and as we are well into no news on the budget situation, 3 weeks in without any real progress, we thought we'd take a look at another big strain on state government, and that is the pension systems. A couple months ago, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that attempts to reform the pension systems in Illinois were not constitutional, and in the meantime there's been continuing investigation over the past several years by both the Daily Herald and the Tribune and lots of different media outlets about some problems in pension systems. And so the Tribune this week in particular came out with a report that says that this practice of spiking teacher pensions at the end of teachers and administrators' careers continues to happen. 10 years ago, lawmakers did pass a law to try to provide some incentive or penalty to stop that practice and curb it from 20–30% salary increases that spike pensions to making districts pay a penalty if they pay more than 6%. Right. But you could still get a 6% raise in each of the last 4 years of your career, but the local school district's taxpayers would supposedly have to pay.
And for years before that, this had been a tremendous problem at the state level because these local districts would grant these giant pay increases at the end of someone's career, drive up their annual pension payment, and they would pass all that extra cost on to the state.
Right. And so the law was established to try to stop that practice and to make local school boards who negotiate these contracts think that their own constituents were going to have to pay. Mm-hmm. So the Tribune, through FOIAs and other research practices, actually discovered and had an extensive report this week that over the past decade since this law passed, school districts have piled up $150 million in penalties, but through all kinds of waivers that are perfectly legal inside this law, most of those penalties have not been paid, and they have actually been passed on to all of the state's taxpayers. Mm-hmm. So really only about a quarter of the $150 million in penalties was actually paid by local taxpayers instead of being spread all around the state to state taxpayers. And so the burden is still out there on all of us.
And this is a real point of agitation with people in Chicago because the Chicago teacher pensions do not get the state subsidies that the suburbs and the downstate school districts get. And that's why you've had, over the last 5–6 years, you've had the idea brought up of making all local school districts cover all of their pension costs so that they don't pass off parts of them to the state. And really, if you could figure out a way to do it so you don't suddenly inflict a bunch of financial pain onto every school district, if you ramped it in, that's something that has to be done because these individual school districts have to be responsible for their own costs. They can't have an added bonus that they can throw in because the state's going to chip in. And you know, as there's an argument that the funding formula for Chicago schools balances that out. I don't know about that. All I know is that this is a problem that has to be brought under control.
And it's one actually that Michael Madigan has talked a lot about, and he's kind of the one who's been driving that train, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Speaking of Michael Madigan, the House had a pension hearing to take a look at a new proposal that Governor Rauner came out with for making some pension changes, and the consensus on every union member who testified at that hearing was that it was unconstitutional. But it was interesting because even the Democrats on that committee, Elaine Neckritz, has been one of the lawmakers who's a Democrat from suburban Northbrook. She's been, studying the pension. She chairs the pension committee.
She was an early champion of some of the pension reform bills a few years ago.
And was, kind of an architect of the law that was declared unconstitutional. And she just, she described it herself as a rant. And at the end of this committee hearing, she said, we're going to have to pay. Yeah. The Constitution says what it says. But everyone needs to understand that pensions are kind of taking away from every other function of state government. It's costing school funding, it's costing disabled children, it's costing the sick, the poor, the elderly. Social service funding is decreasing as the pension payments continue to increase.
Well, it's Squeezy the Python all over again.
It is.
Squeezy hasn't gone, Squeezy may have not been on our minds, but the principle behind it is still very much there. Pensions are going to take up a big chunk of our state budget. One of the ideas that's tossed around now is, since the Supreme Court decision essentially said you're going to have to pay what you owe, one of the ideas that's come up is to refinance what we owe. And instead of paying it through 2045, go out another 12 years or another certain amount of time to get the yearly payments down to a reasonable level. It's still going to be a sizable chunk.
Now, you heard from Senate President John Cullerton this week,
right.
And he still thinks there's one more approach that could work.
President Cullerton has suggested that you could do pension reform if there's a connection between giving active employees a choice between having their pensionable salary frozen at where it is now in exchange for keeping in retirement your annual 3% cost of living compounded adjustment, or having all your pay increases throughout your career apply to your pension with a different COLA formulation. But whether he says it's constitutional. He was right on the last one being unconstitutional.
Yep.
Now, Governor Rauner has some different pension ideas, and I was at a press conference with President Cullerton this week, and he had some interesting things to say about the philosophical differences between he and the governor on pension reform. Here's a quick audio clip from his press conference.
Be happy to talk to you about pension reform. I sat down with the governor for an hour and a half. I brought my lawyer in. I went through the Supreme Court decision, which I obviously had predicted before. It was unanimous. It was unconstitutional. We had passed that bill only because we needed a test case to prove to the rest of the world that the pension clause says what it says. And so we have presented to the governor a constitutional pension reform bill that will save $1 billion a year starting in 2 years. And we gave it to him. And he took it and said, that's very interesting. And he came back with his own pension bill, which is just as unconstitutional as the last one.
Okay, so obviously there's a long
wide gulf
gap
here
between where President Cullerton is on possible pension reform and where Governor Rauner is on possible pension reform. Still a huge issue. After the Supreme Court ruling in May, you read that decision and it's very hard to see very much wiggle room for making any change that doesn't diminish pensions. So I've kind of gone from being hopeful that the last pension reform bill would survive to being kind of a skeptic that there's much of anything we can do that clause is pretty simple in the Constitution. There's not much tricky about it.
No, but maybe there are some things that could be done around pension abuses and pension spiking.
That's exactly right. And the teachers' retirement system is the biggest in the state. And it's the one that if you're going to have some reforms like what the Tribune pointed out this week, that's where it's really, really needed.
All right. Well, that's it for this week's edition. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next edition of Only in Illinois.